Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste.
Namaste, and apologies for the late start.
Today we will continue our exploration on the theme of Sanskrit language. And first we'll take a few comments and questions. And as usually, we will receive more questions at our email ID integralstudies.in@gmail.com. Or during our live conversation, you may address your question. I will read the first comment from Om Namo Bhagavate. Regarding ancient Latin and Greek and modern Greek, Italian and mostly in Spanish, there are to be read and written without almost any cancellation of vowels or consonants, as happens in French or English. None of these languages have diphthongs and the vowels are open, a, e, I, o, u. Then we also have three types of different accent on E that are 4 different sounds. So we will take the first question.
So it's an interesting observation that when you go back to the original languages, as far back as you go, we do not have this idea of silent letters. In French, for example, when a verb goes into plural, the plural ends with ent, nth, which obviously goes back to the Latin, but it's not pronounced today. And so for the actual speaker, it simplifies. It's approaching the English language where you have exactly the same sound, whether it's male, female, one person or multiple people. So it kind of tends to simplify. It becomes natural for the modern mind, which is slightly lazy, which does not want to enter details, which wants to blur distinctions. And so much of the language richness and detailing is lost. But as you go back, you recover those details and you find that no sounds are made silent. All sounds are actually pronounced. I remember a few serials were recently made. There was one which was of the gladiators and went into several seasons. And what they did was they were speaking in English, but the English was structured as in Latin. So it was as if you were hearing the Latin language but with English words and with a grammar structure of Latin, which was fascinating to hear. And I had a very strong resonance with Sanskrit and even the sense of the past. It touched more deeply. There were no needless articles, the, etc., which are common to the modern English language. Those were just dropped. And you got a sense of what Latin speech was like. Similarly, there was one series which was about some northern Europe series, and there, when they visit France, this is going back 300, 400 years, the French were speaking in the way French was spoken 300 or 400 years ago. And you had to struggle to understand what they were saying, but no letters were suppressed. You went in plural, you went with the ante sound, which is like the coming from Latin, etc. So it makes a very big difference. And then the sound also, vowels, as you say, they are pure, and all the variations, a, o, all those things are very distinct. And it makes a big difference to the listener also, and to the feel and the quality, particularly of force that comes in the language. We can go to the next question. He says, being a musician and fond of precise use of language, French and English mainly, and etymology, I deeply appreciate the new angle of the present series. I find the latest session on the Varnamala very precious. Thank you so much. Apart from the 49 notebooks written by Sri Aurobindo, could you advise an accessible way for beginners to explore the Deva Bhasha? So, you will recall in the first session on this, I had actually mentioned the 49 notebooks, Sri Aurobindo's description and elaboration of the root sounds. But I don't think that would be a start for learning the language. It may not be the best start. It is certainly a start to understand the roots and appreciate and go deeper. But for learning, I had suggested at that point the Sanskrita Bharati. It would not be recommended if you want to go into the roots, because then we are simplifying, making it accessible, but also in the process taking it farther away from the roots. I do not know any course which teaches from the roots other than what Sampadanand Mishra had started at one point. So when I asked him this question, he responded by saying that he plans to start very soon, for which he has already made the notes which are ready, and very soon he plans to do this. So I will also ask him to let us know, and I will make the announcement here, and perhaps if possible we will invite him also to share with us certain things as part of this discussion, because the kind of mastery that Dr. Sampadananda Mishra has of the Sanskrit language from the roots, from within outward, from deep study and dwelling on Sri Aurobindo's various notebooks and writings, I do not know anybody else in the world who has that kind of mastery. So for me, what he has developed, what he has acquired is extremely valuable, extremely precious, and to learn from him, from the way he has been able to organize within himself, would be one of the most direct perhaps for our purpose and for understanding and knowing Sanskrit from inside out. So I will certainly let you know, and perhaps we will also try to invite him to join us in one session here. But this was the background I wanted to share regarding this for learning. And for those of you who are very keen, certainly start with whatever works for you. But when Sampadanand starts his classes, it will be worth it. There's the next question from Luke, where he asks, what about sounds such as H in Spanish, as in naranja, produced in the throat, Th as in cocina in Spanish, or E and A as in cera. I'm not sure I'm getting it exact, but or the as in English, as in the the, both produced with the tip of the tongue out. What about these sounds? So if you look at these, and there are other variations of sounds which I found in certain languages in Africa, they also have the sound. They'll snap the tongue, and that's a sound which is part of the language. It's very interesting to see some of these very distinctive sound variations you find all over the world. But when you come back to the Sanskrit Varna Mala, you will find that these are actually certain specializations of the Varna Mala, which I will, let me get back this. Okay. So we have the Varna Mala here, and you will recall how the Varna Mala gives you the layout, the matrix of the sounds. If you take, for example, the question from Luke of the Spanish Kh, naranja. So it is this Kh is closest to the Kh sound. Just a minute. Let me see if I can annotate. Kh. It's this sound. Kh. But it also comes close to G or G. So in Greek, for example, modern Greek, there are certain sounds which come similar to G, but it's a G. Agapi. Agapi, it will not be agapi, it will be agapi. G. So G or H. Or in French, the R sound, H, presque. It's the same H sound slightly higher up, but it approaches K, and it is a variation of the R. So you see how some of these variations come in, and if you go back a century or two, perhaps it was a R, and perhaps it was a hard R, which in time has become R, and then H, depending on south or north or east or west, slight variations. But you'll see inevitably all these sounds tend to be variations from within this framework. Even the sound which in one of the African languages, the snapping of the tongue, could come close to D, but it's done just with the tip of the tongue. So it's as if you try to drag D towards B, and or D. You took the D sound and drag it down, and you'll get something close to that. So this is just to show you There can be variations, but all of them eventually come back to these. And when you think about it, a fully stretched spectrum will inevitably settle to something in this framework. So this was just to share the place of these variations, and that they are not really contradicting anything. They're just specializations of sounds. Sandhya has asked, in Telugu, school board has removed a few vowels. Okay, Alina is back. You can go to Sandhya's question. You are silent.
Sorry. Yes. In Telugu, school board has removed few vowels like ru and lu. It feels like they are adding to the distortion of the language. What right do they have to remove such important aspects of the language?
Yes, exactly. This was the point which Sampadananda made, that the moment you do any kind of standardization, there is a reduction and simplification. And unfortunately, this is one of those. And much of this comes from the fact that the large parts of India today are anglicized in pronunciation, in sounds, in mind, in thought. Now, I made a serious mistake last time when, or the time before, when bhasha, I took the root bhas. And Sampadananda pointed out, no, it's not bhas, it comes from bhash. Bhash is the root. But why did I make that mistake? Because in my mind, I was still holding bhasha, B-A-S-H-A, and looking at the root, it came to B-A-S, bhas, B-H-A-S. Sh being written S and H in English, somewhere inside subliminally, subconsciously, because I'm still not rooted in the English, in the Sanskrit language the way I am in the English language. So it's a struggle sometimes, and sometimes these slips happen at a subliminal or subconscious level. And the problem in India today is because in the last 50 years, there has been a very hard turn to the English language, largely remnant of the colonial era, and the eagerness to be colonized. Actually, it comes from there. That certain sounds which are not part of the English or anglicized vocabulary seem alien to the common ear. And then you have these politicians who come with agendas. Many of these agendas involve the agenda to convert. And they have used English powerfully for purpose of conversion. And you will see how most of the English language schools are run by missionaries who come with the agenda of conversion. They prop up English language as an advantage for job opportunities. And with that comes the agenda also to anglicize, not just in speech, not just in thought, but eventually in values and then in religious allegiance. So there's a whole agenda there. And so a lot of these, as you know, Andhra Pradesh has been through a massive conversion drive, particularly in the last 30 years. Various chief ministers have pushed forward the agenda on a scale that is so troubling. I don't want to elaborate here, to the point that even they took funds from the temples and used that to fund new Christian converts to visit Jerusalem on a pilgrimage from the money taken from Hindu temples. And there's a whole complex thing there. I don't want to go into details, just so that you're aware that a lot of these things come from such agendas. So sounds also need to be reduced to anglicize and to change the thinking. There's a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes. This is in the evening talks where he's speaking with Nirod Baran, Purani, and a few others. And this is, let's say, 1938, 39, 40 perhaps. And he says to them, the Indian mind is different. I'm paraphrasing. And then he says to them, you people are already half westernized in your mind. Now remember, this is 1938-39. All of them had English medium education, and yet India had not been so anglicized. But the fact that your originating medium of language is English already tends to warp your thinking in a different way. Not just in values, but in the very way that you think. And we'll come to this later as we study the structure of Sanskrit grammar and thought structure also. I am actually challenged on how deep to go or how wide to go and how detailed to go. We'll just explore as we go along for a few more weeks. We'll see where it takes us. But this is one of my intentions, to also look at the structure of thought and how it modifies the thinking process itself, and with it the values of our thought and feelings. But this is, to Sandhya's question, this is one of the very damaging influences in modern times. The advantage that they have today, because of the massive scale involved in universalizing education and in the power of the social media, which is global, that one decision taken by someone in power is enough to impact a mass in a way that was never possible before. You see, in the past, let's say in India, we had 300 about kingdoms. If one king went mad and imposed something on his kingdom, there were other kingdoms to hold what was true, and over time things would heal and adjust themselves. Today, one authority can massively impact the entire state or the country or the world. I believe I had quoted Hillary Clinton once, and I have the quote in her speaking it out with the video, where she's asked, "What would you like to do once you retire from politics?" She said, "I would like to be the head of Facebook, because then you can decide, you can control how people think." You must understand the political powers and those who control the social media, the deep state and the cabal structures, think in these terms. Their intention is to control how people think. And so these are distortions, perversions being made all over with such interests. And this is a very small part of the larger agenda. We can go to the next question.
From Nikhil Kumar.
Bharat.
Matra?
Bharat.
Sorry, Bharat first. Did people in Indus Valley civilization in Bronze Age India speak or use Vedic Sanskrit language?
Yes. This is the problem we have of a history that has already been colonized. We actually do not know that our history goes back at least 10,000 years in continuous lineage of kings. You see, the Mahabharata taking place, let's say about 5,000 years ago. The kings of the Mahabharata, from there you can go back at least 20 lineages of kings. And assuming each one has lived or ruled about 50 years, you can see straight away that that becomes another 1,000 years at least, and further on. So the problem of history today, especially with India, is that what we are taught is completely baseless. This whole business of Bronze Age is a European context, perhaps, at best. And even there, the true European history has been largely suppressed by the church or even destroyed by the church. But when you take that out of context and apply it on India and say, oh, India was also in Bronze Age at the same time as Europe, or even that there was such a thing as Bronze Age, is completely wrong. Because the metallurgical knowledge of India, and a very precise and highly developed knowledge, goes back 10,000 years. So to state this, for example, in such open terms would attract criticism of the so-called experts. But what makes an expert is the fact that he has mugged up what he was told to mug up and repeats it now, and that makes him the expert. How many of these so-called experts have actually gone and verified the Indian texts and the metallurgical texts and the actual dating of those texts or their references, etc.? If you go back to the period of the Mahabharata, let's say about 5,000 years ago, you find there already very advanced references to metallurgical technologies. And as I've mentioned before to you, even flying machines. These are described in the Ramayana. So they are not fantasies, they are real. So obviously there is a very advanced metallurgical knowledge. So I will first discard this whole Bronze Age idea, but coming to the question itself, Indus Valley civilization, did they use Sanskrit language? So again, I have a problem with that Indus Valley civilization. There is no such thing as an Indus Valley civilization. That's again a concocted framework of the British colonial history of India. What happened was there was the Saraswati river which at some point dries up. You must remember, in the Veda, it is described that the river has dried up. So straight away, that takes you back a minimum of 7000 BC. Straight away. And then at that point, it's already drying up or has dried up. So the entire civilizational base there had to migrate. So there is a migration, there is no invasion. And this is the evidence even today archaeologically. Because they migrated, those parts were left largely dried up, desert like. The Saraswati river mostly goes underground. Even today, you can dig deep enough and you get very powerful force of water in certain places. But the place survived because nobody lived on top of it later on. So for the British, it is convenient. Oh, you dig, you find here are some pottery shards, okay, and you call it Indus Valley. There was not Indus Valley, it was the Saraswati Valley, if you may want to call it that. But why is that place important? Because it survived. But I would suggest you go to a place like, let's say, Varanasi, which goes back in history again at least 10,000 years. It's a sacred place. The problem was, every so many hundred years, the old Varanasi would be changed so dramatically, rebuilt so dramatically, that all evidence of the prior Varanasis would get buried deeper and deeper. So perhaps if you dug deep enough, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 layers, you might still find pottery shards which date to the same period as the what is called this Indus Valley, or more correctly Saraswati Valley civilization. But they were present there. They were present everywhere, all over India. So I'm going to generalize the question, having made these 2 corrections. Did the people of that period speak Vedic Sanskrit? So the impression I have is not quite, because it had already changed. My study of the dating and the nature of the change is limited, but I will quote from Dr. Sampadananda Mishra, and I've put a link to his talk on this topic, 3 of his talks actually, 2 talks and 1 article. And what he mentions there is that there is first of all the original Deva Bhasha, the language of the gods, from which there are various degrees of reduction that Sri Aurobindo speaks of. Vedic Sanskrit itself we might consider as a certain degree of reduction, from which there are further reductions through the phase that we would call the Ramayana and Mahabharata time, so going back 5,000 years or a little more. And then subsequently, the more structured and systematization of the language itself and its more rigid grammar structures, which you find, which are of course highly appreciated, but which also mentalize. And those would be going back, let's say, 2,000 years about. That being the case, what Sampadananda observes in that talk is the simple Sanskrit that Mother refers to would correspond more closely to the Sanskrit of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So in what we will study today, we will also understand something of how this works. But for the moment, I will leave it at that. Recognize that even within India, going back 10,000 years, what we have as the original Sanskrit that we can go back to is still a reduction from something even earlier. And why this happens, Sri Aurobindo will explain to us. I hope we'll cover it today. We go to the next question.
From Nikhil Kumar. Mantra has been written in Sanskrit. Since mantra is revelatory, will you explain how a Sanskrit word is revelatory as opposed to arbitrary feature of a word in general?
You disconnected in the audio.
I'm very sorry. I think my connection
The
is
question
not
is,
good.
as opposed to arbitrary feature of a word in general. I think we lost you in the last part of the sentence. Can you also take Revati's question?
What would the words Aim, Hrim, and Shrim means, sir? They sound extremely powerful.
Yes. So we have these 2 questions which are regarding mantra, and particularly bija mantra, that is seed mantras. And we will explore something of this today with a text from Kapali Shastriyar. But I will first link it to discussions we had last time and also make for a couple of other corrections. So one was the correction of the root of bhas and bhash. But also I think last time I was speaking of water and various kinds of water. And apa actually goes back to the root up, which comes from that which gives life. And I had said something different. So I just want to put on record a correction. I also made a reference to Katapayadi system of numbering, where we take the language structure and 5 by 5 matrix. So obviously, it suggests to us a numbering system with multiple rows. And the Katapayadi is actually structured in the horizontal sequence. So if I may show you the picture once again. So if you remember Katapai Adi, Ka, Ta, and you skip another row, Pa, and Ya. So you see it is structured Ka, Cha, Ka, Kha, Ga, Gha, Nga, Cha, Cha, Ja, Ja, Nya. That makes for 10. So you start counting with Ka, Kha, Ga, Gha, Nga, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Cha, Cha, Ja, Ja, Nya, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then Ta again starts 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Ta, Ta, Da, Dha, Na, and Ta, Tha, Da, Dha, Na. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Pa again starts with 1, Pa, Pa, Ba, Bha, Ma, and Ya again starts. So I've put a few links regarding the Katapayadi system, and there's a very interesting reference which comes from the Wikipedia also. Do take a look for those who are interested. And there, that particular verse with the prayer forward and backward and the pi to so many decimal places, that example is also given, which actually Sampadanand Mishra also gives in one of his talks and other books. We'll come to those examples later, which shows you the flexibility and the power of the language in representing things. But that will be part of a later discussion. Remember, right now we were focused on this idea of the basic sounds. We saw how they were mapped along the chakras and their petals. I had mentioned that I would share with you an image of the chakras, and so I have to give you an example of this. This comes from this particular book, Hands of Light, which is by Barbara Ann Brennan, and illustrations by Joss Smith. Now, this was highly recommended by Ingo Swan because the drawings here he found to be the most accurate. Most people who make these drawings of auras, etc., don't really have the vision, or their vision is highly limited or simplified. Here's an example of how it appears when you see the aura and the chakras from the side or from the front. Now, this is quite a very precise description. You see the chakra appears out like a vortex, emerging like a vortex, like a cone. But this, if you go closer, and this requires a very specialized development of the vision, of the subtle vision, then the chakra appears like this. And I want you to note particularly the richness of the details here. You can see within the cone circular rings inside. Can you make out in this particular case? There are 6 around and 1 in the center, perhaps 7 or maybe 6 in this case. And below is the same thing in a child, where it is undeveloped. So in a sense, the structural development within the chakra actually is structurally seen, physically seen even, as representing the degree of maturity of the chakra. Here's another example of the same chakra structure more closely, and with showing different kinds of distortions. So you can see in this particular case, one of the petals, we may call it petals, is projecting out unbalanced. In the other case, it is disconnected from its root, and various other variations. I'm just giving you this as an example of the kind of rich detail that a highly developed clairvoyant would have, and without going further into this, but you get an idea of the sense of what is meant by petals. Each of these petals is a whirl in itself within the overall whirl. And so petal is just a very human and limited way of describing what those actual things are. We come now to our larger discussion for today, And I want to go into the depth of this sound, and particularly the sense that the sound itself is a power, has a power innate, and even is a deity, or corresponds to a deity depending on how one looks at it. We first look at Sri Aurobindo's text, and we complete the text which we were reading last time. So you will recall we were reading how he described that the language of man is not framed on earth but in heaven, and by the threefold energy of eternal truth, manifesting force, and sustaining delight. That is the Satchidananda's three aspects, that we find this expressing itself. Everything is finally expressing a combination of these three, and naturally this also is true for language or sound. So he says the original language was based on certain eternal types of sound, developed by certain laws of rhythmic variation, perfectly harmonious and symmetrical in its structure and evolution. Now, perfectly symmetrical, perfectly harmonious means all sounds equally would have their right place and right relation with everything else. And this would be the Deva Bhasha, language of the gods, in the Satya Yuga. Then you see all the variations, we don't repeat that. The backbone of the skeleton is composed of the roots of the original language that survive. So the roots which survive, there are more roots, but not all have survived. The rest is various principles of word formation. So I skip again the paragraph which we read last time, and the last paragraph of this writing, he says, I shall first indicate the principle on which the roots of the Deva Bhasha were formed. So how do the roots come about? You see, you want to go back to the origin of things, you have to go all the way back. You can't just say, oh, there are these roots. How did they come? Why are these considered roots? So Sri Aurobindo is the only writer who goes back all the way to fundamentals in every single subject that he touches. Whether it is spiritual practices, knowledge of yoga, philosophy, or in this case, philology, root sounds of language, the science of mantra, the cycles of social development, etc., political development, everything, he always goes back to fundamental roots and rebuilds from there in a way that you can understand. Now, certain things he points out, and this is the nature of his writing. When he goes back all the way to the root is what? And he says, nature has decided. So it's very clear, certain things are, we may even say, arbitrarily a decision of nature. Now, obviously, nature herself is not entirely arbitrary. That arbitrary decision would be based on certain principles. Where that is available, Sri Aurobindo will tell you what those are. Where that is not available and nature says, okay, at this point in history, she's going to go into this direction and discard that other process. That's an arbitrary decision. But it may have a rationale, and if there is one, he may give it. But still, the decision to make that at that point is arbitrary. And so Sri Aurobindo will tell you, nature decides or nature does. That's the, let's say, first principle from which that process began. But here he says it's not that. It's not nature's arbitrariness, it goes to something even deeper, of which perhaps nature becomes an expression. So, what are the roots on which that Deva Bhasha, language of the gods, are formed? He explains, all Shabda, Shabda loosely translated as sound, or he puts in bracket Vak. Vak is speech, or speech which is the essential speech. All Shabda, Vak, as it manifests out of the Akasha, ether, by the force of Matarishwan, the great active and creative energy, and is put in its place in the flux of formed things, apas, corresponds to waters, carries with it certain definite significances, artha. So he is giving you Sanskrit words to link it to the larger body of existing knowledge of the philology, etc. But he is giving you now the underlying structure of how this happens. The definite significance is the end result and the correspondence. Something begins as a vibration, manifesting out of Akasha. What is Akasha? Ether. What's the characteristic of ether? For those of you who are interested, I would highly recommend that you look up the recent talk that I gave on the 5 elements and how everything emerges through a process of 5 degrees of modification of one indivisible underlying consciousness. But the very first stage of that, which allows one indivisible to become multiple, is a self awareness rhythming in relation to itself. This movement of rhythms or vibrations and the state in which it is held in the expanse of awareness is akasha or ether. And everything emerges from that primordial vibration. We'll again come back to this idea as we will read the text of Kapali Shastriyar. But you must understand, nothing can be manifest unless first there is some kind of waving, variation of consciousness, of vibration. Of what? Of that which exists in relation to itself. What is a wave? We may, for example, look at a wave purely in terms of an flat average line, and the wave forms around this line. In other words, the wave of a projection up or down is in relation to something which is constant. So there is a constant, unchanging consciousness. That consciousness enters in relation with itself and changes that relationship with itself. Nothing has moved, nothing has changed. Consciousness is still what it ever was. But it is playing in relation with itself in awareness only, and in force of awareness, and in delight of awareness. Okay? So the rhythming out, that vibrational stage of rhythming out is a first essential basis from which forms and any distinctions can emerge. If there is not this, nothing can ever happen. Nothing will ever be manifest. So the first stage of manifestation, all shabda, vak, sound, vibration, as it manifests out of this akasha, vibrational, etheric consciousness. How does it manifest from there? By the force of Matarishwan, the great active and creative energy. Sri Aurobindo comments on this Matarishwan from his commentary on the Isha Upanishad, Tasmin apo Matarishva dadhati. In that the master of life pours the waters. So it's something like that, the translation. So this Matarishwan, he is referred to earlier as master of life, or here in this case, the great active and creative energy. So it is the force of this creative energy which draws from that vibrational stage of the ether and is put in its place in the flux of formed things, apas, which would correspond to the water principle, carries with it certain definite significances. So the moment you bring something out in this way, it carries a distinct significance. Now that significance, when you read first, you will want, oh, this means that. You see, this is the mental habit we have from the surface modern languages. The sound horse means that particular creature. Water sound means this particular liquid. But when you go to root sounds, it's no more associations of objects with the sounds. It's associations of certain combinations of qualities. And we'll come to this. So now this he explains. These definite significances, these are determined by the elements through which it has passed. So 5 elements, we come back to the 5 elements. Remember, originating in the ether, it has to pass through the other elements. Nothing can be created unless it has the 5 elemental states or self-modifications of pure consciousness backing what becomes the eventually formed expression. So this is what he now explains. Shabda, sound, vak, vibration, appears in the akasha. First, you have the vibration there. Before that, there is none. Travels through vayu, the air principle. The second element in which sparsha is the vibration. Sparsha means touch. So in the etheric state, vibration, expansion, contraction is the characteristic. In the second stage, which is what we call the air principle, contact, force, but without sustained form is the principle. So in the second element, you have the touch. So think of it in this way. A sound has its original vibrational quality. Then it leads to a tactile sensation, as if the sound touches you. What is the nature of that touch? Is it soft, hard, sharp, dull, etc.? So there's a touch which comes from the characteristic of this second element. By the vibrations of sparsha, touch, it creates in tejas, the third element, fire, certain forms, and so arrives into being with these three characteristics. So the fire principle in the Veda is described as the creator of forms. Fire is where distinct forms appear, but the forms are not necessarily stable. They will be changing forms. And the water and earth principles make them sticky and then rigid. So first you have pure vibration. Expansion and contraction is the nature of etheric characteristic. Second, the touch that it leads to, from where there is the modification in the domain of the fire principle, where you have form that appears. So keep these three ideas in mind. And so arrives into being with these three characteristics. First, certain contextual vibrations. Secondly, a particular kind of tejas or force. Thirdly, a particular form. So the first element gave the contextual vibrational quality. Second gave a certain force, and third gave a particular form. So contextual vibrational quality, force, form. Now every root sound or every sound, Sri Aurobindo will then describe in terms of these three things. These determine the bhava or general sensation it creates in the mind. And from that sensation, develop its various precise meanings according to the form which it is used to create. So there's a general sensation when you hear a particular sound, and then from there, a precise meaning for the form that you're going to use it to create. I want to create this form, I want to create that form, and the precise meaning comes from there. Now, this we will fully appreciate when we see certain examples, and Sri Aurobindo will give us the examples also. But this text seems to be, that's all there is to it. Word formation stops there. It's as if he has not written more, or if he wrote, we have lost. We don't know. But here you're getting a first clue. Pure vibration, now think of it in these ways. Every possible vibration that you could imagine exists in that state of the etheric principle. From there, every possible variation that you can have of the quality of contact, quality of force, and distinction in form. If you conceive of every possibility and hold it in a kind of a continuum, because given any two, there can be something in between. Okay, that's the original creative consciousness in which all possibilities are held. Now, out of that, as it moves towards domain of form, certain forms tend to sustain more easily than others. Now, we'll see in pure geometry, certain forms are stable, certain forms are not. Certain forms are less stable, certain forms are more stable. And you'll see so much of the Platonic geometry is about this. Platonic solids, as they're called even today in geometry, because that was the attempt to perceive what are underlying structures, stable structures, essential structures represented in geometry. Here we are speaking of representing in form. So there are obviously certain forms, certain sounds, certain qualities, certain quality of force or touch or contact, which are blendings as if of some which are more essential. So for example, if you have a touch, you could measure it in terms of its pressure quality. You could measure it in terms of its movement quality. You could measure it in terms of its heat quality, etc. All variations would be essentially combinations of these. Okay? But these would be as if the markers or the distinctive characteristics around which you could then identify or classify or organize. So this is a first background which we have, based on which we will look at how this process happens. I'm reading now from the text, The Philological Method of the Veda. And Sri Aurobindo explains this now in a more elaborate and detailed way. My researches first convinced me that words, like plants, like animals, are in no sense artificial products, but growths, living growths of sound with certain seed sounds as their basis. So, animals and plants. Why is he using these analogies? Because, like plants, you'll find branchings from the seed sounds with variations. Like animals, there will be progeny and combinations and genetic combinations giving rise to more complex variations. So, out of the seed sounds develop a small number of primitive root sounds with an immense progeny, which have their successive generations and arrange themselves in tribes, clans, families, selective groups, each having a common stock and a common psychological history. So, seed sounds, a small number of primitive root words, and from there everything grows. For the factor which presides over the development of the language was the association by the nervous mind of primitive man of certain general significances, or rather certain general utilities and sense values with articulate sounds. So obviously the s sound has quality, and you can now look at all the three things: the contextual quality, the force quality, the form quality. If you take a form like k, it has a very different of the three, etc. The process of this association was also in no sense artificial but natural, governed by simple and definite psychological laws. Now he's coming to the specifics. In their beginnings, language sounds were not used to express what we should call ideas. They were rather the vocal equivalent of certain general sensations and emotion values. So what happens? You're feeling pain. You go, oh. You see, you're expressing a sensation. I eat this fruit. Delicious. So you are expressing something which corresponds to a general sensation and emotional value. There's no reasoning mind association with it. And if you look at it from a evolution from below up, you will find in primitive humans or animals, this would be the tendency. You come to a dog, the dog likes you, and it goes, makes sounds, or goes, woof, woof. Or if they don't like you, so you have all the sensation that's already conveying to you what is it, their message, isn't it? So that's how you would have it in the primitive human. So then he explains this, elaborates. It was the nerves and not the intellect which created speech. So speech is not something where you say, I have this idea, now what is the sound I will use for it? It goes bottom up. I have this nervous sensation and it bursts out in this particular vibrational quality or sound quality. So nerves which create speech, not intellect. And now comes something brilliant and deeply insightful. To use Vedic symbols, Agni and Vayu, not Indra, were the original artificers of human language. Now again, you get just this one statement, just blows your mind and opens a whole new world. First, you glimpse how these Vedic deities are not abstractions somewhere in some higher worlds. They are active powers operating within us, in our biology, in our nervous system, in our consciousness, in our life energies, in our mind, etc. And each of these deities is as if ruling a certain function or power or even a part of consciousness or part of body. So nerves which create speech, not intellect. Indra is intellect. So Indra is not operating there. It is Agni and Vayu. Vayu in this case would be the life energy. Agni would be the concentrated force of aspiration or will or impulse. As you go down, it becomes blind impulse. You just feel this urge, push, instinct, drive. I don't know why. The life energy which animates or gives to it specific qualities would be the Vayu principle. and Indra is not yet awake. They are preparing the ground for the awakening of Indra. And once Indra comes in, there's an active deity power who assists in the formation and articulation and correspondence of sounds with ideas. So, mind has emerged out of vital and sensational activities. Intellect in man has built itself upon the basis of sense associations and sense reactions. By a similar process, the intellectual use of language has developed by a natural law out of sensational and emotional. So, as it emerged, just as this has emerged in this way, the next from here to mind also, similar process. Words which were originally vital ejections, full of vague sense potentiality, have evolved into fixed symbols of precise intellectual significance. In the English language, for example, the word slice as a verb, slice, you can actually feel the slicing movement of a sharp knife cutting through, isn't it? So there's one example which in one of the talks which I have posted, Dr. Sampadanand Mishra gives this. He gives you the example of the st root, and which becomes the basis for location, sthana, which with the Urdu modification becomes stana, Hindustan, Pakistan, the stana which you see in Kazakhstan. Everywhere that you see the stana comes from the original Sanskrit sthana, which comes from the root stha, and the sense is the sense of fixity, location fixed, or establishing to fix, etc. So what Sampadanand shows is, in fact, this root survives even in English. And he says you take any word in English which starts with st, ends with st, or has st inside, you will tend to find this idea of stability or fixity or rigidity implicit. And he gives certain examples like stand, station, establishment, exist. So obviously in the Latin origins for the English language, you'll find the st sound having all this. And so another example he gives, which, because I'm taking these examples because they're very useful for most of our viewers who know English better than Sanskrit. So he gives the example of the root gru, which means drenched, and by soaking in water, it leads to weight absorption or intensification of weight or growth in weight, etc. So he says all English words which tend to have this meaning of weight or of importance will have this gr sound. So great, you are great. Great has the sense of somehow larger, heavier, more ponderous. Gravity, grand, grow, etc. So these are good examples because it taps our English vocabulary and we can feel how the sound works. But you'll notice, because this is an implicit root power, in the English language, somehow the meaning will always tend to gravitate back, pulled by the gravity, pulled by the weight, pulled by the movement, soaking in, drawing in, drenching, filling, etc. Where this sound comes. So even if you constructed a sound artificially or you picked it from another language and used it long enough, the meaning would tend to move towards what is corresponding to characteristic of the essential sound force. So I'm showing this as an example because we can appreciate more clearly the nature of these variations. Although the seed sounds are the beginning, and although they tend to be lost, they also tend to gravitate back towards the seed again and again drift off. But now Sri Aurobindo is showing us the gradations of this evolution. Then he says, in consequence, the word originally was not fixed to any precise idea. So this is the mistake we make when we look at the root sound. We say, what does this mean? No, it's not what does this mean. What does this feel like? What does this evoke in emotion? And by extension, what does it evoke in thought? That's how we have to look at it. And that's why you can see it becomes almost instinctive, intuitive. It had a general character or quality, guna, which was capable of a great number of applications and therefore of a great number of possible significances. So that quality could apply in many ways. And sometimes two different qualities would relate to something which shares those qualities. So, and this guna quality and its results, it shared with many kindred sounds. At first, therefore, word clans, word families started life on the communal system with a common stock of possible and realized significances and a common right to all of them. So now, depending on your mood or some fine nuance or shade of the nervous sensation associated, grew could become gru, longer, shorter, or even gri, gra, gra, with a variation slanting towards something else. And sometimes they could even become as if interchangeable because they're too close. Their individuality lay rather in the shades of expression of the same idea than in their exclusive right to the expression of a single idea. So you have shades. This is the reason why when you have just a little bit of background of Sanskrit, very shallow as I have, I can still go back to feeling what does this sound have and catch something of it. And sometimes it may be wrong from a technical perspective, but I would have caught some other aspect from another sound which corresponds to this. And still I would have got the sense of it. That's the interesting thing. The history of language was a development from this communal life of words to a system of individual property in one or more intellectual significances. So you have literally a cluster of words which later get reduced to a particular mentalized significance. So now you can see how across time and space, certain parts of that cluster might go in a different direction, go elsewhere, and so on, which makes for those variations. Or many would be lost eventually. The principle of partition was at first fluid, then increased in rigidity until word families and finally single words were able to start life on their own account. That's the modern condition today. The problem with this, of course, is that in every language, a word has complex nuances associated. So in Russian, I was told, I don't know how true it is. You remember Gorbachev made these two terms, he introduced two words, perestroika and what was the other word? I don't recall now. So he introduced these two words, and when it was translated into English, they had to retain the word to retain that particular nuance because the translation lost something of it. And equally, unfortunately, these things have become a little old in my memory now. There was one word in English which had no corresponding word in Russian. So they had to import the word from English and pronounce it in the Russian way. And so there are things like this. You have no equivalent. Glasnost, yes, very nice, yes, glasnost. So glasnost and perestroika. And even now, you have to pause and really understand, appreciate the context in which the word is understood in that language. And the other word, which was from English to Russian, I was told, maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I had read long ago, alternativa. So this particular nuance that comes with the word alternative. Do you have an alternative? So something equivalent which could replace this with not too different a shade of meaning. And I was told that there was no equivalent word in, there's no alternative. That phrase could not be translated into Russian without losing something significant. So they literally use the word alternativa, pronounced in the Russian way. So my point is, such things happen because you've already in the mind fixed two or distinct meanings with particularization of context. Now, what happens if in real life you experience something which is in between these two? Will you combine these two words, or will you extend this word now to include this particular meaning, or will you extend that word to include this particular meaning, or will you make two different extensions depending on the nuance that you want to highlight, and construct a third word also? Inevitably, there are gaps in experience for which or concept where there are no fixed words available the moment you fixate too much. Whereas in the closer to the original language, you could easily blend in, modify words to drift in the direction that you wanted, to cover the full space of experiences and qualities, gunas. Now with the mentalization, you can't. So you have to effectively, having an experience, reduce the experience to a known word idea again and again. So there was a famous book at one point in which this concept of deeper knowing, deeper learning, really understanding intuitively, which in Sanskrit would mean Veda or Veti, a variation of Ved, with luminosity of awakened knowledge, where you have the aha, I know it, that experience. There's no equivalent for it in English. So there was a novel which was called Stranger in a Stranger Land, about a Martian who comes on Earth. He has this power of true knowing. And so he uses the word, and they invented the word grok. So the novelist invents this word grok. Do you grok it? Means, do you deeply, intuitively identify with the full experience that the word represents? That was the sense of the word grok, which would be the Sanskrit word with Veda. But because no English word, they created this. This became automatically part of the English language now. But coming from a very bad root sound, grok has nothing of the sense of that feeling sensationally. And I think it is from this now that there is an artificial intelligence which is being created with the same name and so on. But the point was, there was no word for that idea. And this we find repeatedly in the spiritual domain. That's why the English language has to borrow terms from Sanskrit. Karma, for example, is one such, for which there is no equivalent concept even in the language, in the civilizational values. So karma introduces a new concept, but because even there's no word close enough that you could have used, you have to import the word itself. So we get an idea of how this happens also, and the limitation that comes with this fixity of idea association. The last stage, so until single words are used to convey an idea, and single words now can live on their own. The last stage of the entirely natural growth of language comes when the life of the word is entirely subjected to the life of the idea which it represents. Now, if your idea changes, the word itself is compelled to follow. For in the first stage of language, the word is as living or even a more living force than its idea. So the word gives birth to idea. Now the idea is giving birth. So sound determines sense. In its last stage, the positions have been reversed. The idea becomes all important, the sound secondary. And so that's where the power of expression is completely lost, or has got so covered up that it barely resonates at the back of the mind on an intuitive level. A few words, a few drops of words, but those words are then powerfully used in literature in order to carry this mantric potency of sound itself. And what is interesting in Sri Aurobindo's writings is that he's somehow able to bring those forward, because even though he uses the English language, he has the base of Latin and Greek and Sanskrit, and of course he knows the Deva Bhasha. So he's actually able to bring certain words and use them even with rhythms which capture something of that, as close as the English language could represent it. We continue now. This comes to a very important part of the process. Another feature of the early history of language is that it expresses at first a remarkably small stock of ideas, and these are the most general notions possible and generally the most concrete. So remember I pointed to this example of the touch. What are the underlying variations that it could be built upon? And you'll find eventually it comes down to certain very basic things. So what are those? Such as light, motion, touch, substance, extension, force, speed, etc. You have just come back from the forest, you have met some dragon, let's say. What are you going to say about it? All that you will describe will be reduced to these characteristics, generally speaking. Oh, big, heavy, large, overwhelming. First impression. Fear, danger, panic, another impression. Depending on the nature of your dragon. Fire, hot air, anger, whatever it is. Or if this dragon is very nice and sweet but flies with big wings, that would be the characteristics, and you'll have sounds, words for that, etc. Speed, fast, rapid, swift. When it caught a rabbit, it went chick. Oh, this is scary. But the swiftness. Afterwards, there is a gradual increase in variety of idea and precision of idea. So you see how, with the evolution of the human consciousness, the language must follow. And that's how you lose already the root origins, inevitably. The progression is from the general to the particular, from the vague to the precise, from the physical to the mental, from the concrete to the abstract, from the expression of an abundant variety of sensations about similar things to the expression of precise difference between similar things, feelings, and actions. This progression is worked out by processes of association in ideas which are always the same, always recurrent. And although no doubt due to the environments and actual experiences of the men who spoke the language, they wear the appearance of fixed natural laws of development. So when you look at this complex process, he's showing you that there are very simple laws which determine this development. And after all, what is a law but a process which has been worked out by the nature of things in response to the necessities of their environment and has become the fixed habit of their action. So I'm not going to go further. He develops this idea. You may read, I've put the link again for this. And then he discusses how this works out in the Vedic interpretation and so on. Okay, I think we'll leave it at this. Now, we'll take an example which Sri Aurobindo gives us of how this works with a particular sound. So, again, there's a link here, the un family. And he shows from the un family, what is interesting is there are 6 groups of meanings which emerge. So, I'm going to just describe to you, I won't go into detail. The descendants of un, number 1 has the meaning of being. Large category. It's family of sounds which overall represent the sense of being. So, under that there are variations, sub-variations. Under being, vague and general, to live, etc. Idea of substance, mass, extension. Idea of expansion tending to motion. Idea of subtleness, slight substance. So, 4 variations under being. This is one group. Next, under un is a family of words relating to motion, to move, to go about, water, to cart, the cart, etc. Third family has to do with light, anal, anna, anikam, etc. Fourth category family is sound, anaka, kettle drum or thunderbolt, etc. Fifth category is contact, anu, anuka, anuja, etc. I'm not going into the words, but the whole group of words which relate to describe contact. And then he again relates to Greek, Latin, etc. And there is one more, 6th. Okay, so five categories. So you can see the broad thing is from that unroot, being, varying variations of it which include living, giving birth, etc. Must, existing with mass, subtlety, lightness, expansion, etc. Then there is movement, which is a category of words, light, fire, sun, etc. category of words, sound, and contact, nature of contact, etc. Now you can see how the broad directions in which the word evolves, there's a pattern which relates to those basic needs of sense experience and emotional experience which would be common to anything that you have contact with. So after this, we go to one very quick table that also I have kept in the link, notes on root sounds. Now he tells you, when you go to the root sound, what is the nature of that contact? What is the quality that comes? Remember, it's a vibration which has gone through those 3 layers of the 5 elements. And what does it carry? This work Sri Aurobindo has done. He actually tells you each sound and what it carries as a quality. Remember, we should not look for mental idea. We should look for the quality of what it conveys. And we come to something fascinating. A, E and U. These are the basic vowels. A, he says, represents or conveys the sense of absolute existence. E conveys relative existence. U conveys pervasive, contained, or progressive existence. Now, what is the distinction between these three? And try to feel the sense, for which you must go back into your nerves and emotional level, and for which we can go back to the structure of the mouth also, and notice what happens. When you do nothing at all, how do you make the sound? You relax everything. Do nothing except allow the sound vibration to come through. Right? Is the most basic, simple, effortless exist. There's no reference to anything, no effort. The moment you move to E, there's as if something in relation to perhaps. And U, he says, pervasive, contained, or progressive. There's a sense of movement, pervasing as in spreading out, containing as it embracing and holding, or progressing as in unrolling. The U has that sense. Now, you have to really go deep into the quality of the sound, or you program yourself that this is the sense of it. You can go either way. There are other sounds where it is more easy, but in the vowels, it is certainly the E and U, it's not initially obvious. But when you dwell on it, you will see how it feels. But then if you study the nature of the sounds in words, you'll find how this conveys, and it is valid. Now we come to K, K, G, G, Ch, Ch, J, J, etc. So K, he describes as possession, mastery, creation, action. So any word which begins with the K sound in Sanskrit. But I would suggest, as in the examples that Sampadanand has shown, even in the English language, because it is deriving from certain roots, this tendency will be there. And you will remember, I use the word karma or kara. Hand is kara. And kriya, process, technique, method, or effort made for using a particular process. Kriya yoga, for example. A technique is how you would translate loosely. Or anything with ka will tend to have this action aspect. Kara particularly has the action aspect, but ka purely possession, mastery, creation, action. Kha, you'll see the same thing now, slightly modified by the ha thing, ha, which is force, attack, invasion, insistence, attrition or detrition. Ga, contact, motion, action upon. Gha, now you've amplified force, violent contact, hostile action, strong motion. Interesting. Ch, swift and brilliant action, existence, contact, and so on. T becomes hardness, forced, crudity. D, dullness, persistence, obstinacy. Now you see, in English, we have a lot of slang words. And often you notice slang words align to the root sounds much better because they come from this. You know, among young people, when you want to say somebody is dumb or dull, you have this duh sound. You say, duh, this guy is dumb. He goes, duh. He doesn't understand anything. Dullness, persistence, obstinacy, rajaso tamasik. Duh. Interesting. So you see how across, even in modern languages, you invent a word, you will tend to follow this quality. So I'm coming to other sounds which are more distinctive. Na, gentle but effective relation. P, soft touch or impact, kindly relation, possessive action. Now we come to other special sounds. M. Remember, M is one word you go lips joined and M or To make the M sound, you have to say M. But actually, when you use it, it is always ending with or combining with another letter, with another letter. B. It'll join with some other letter, but will always bring it to some kind of closure, and then something else starts after. So, limitation, finality, completion. Y, interesting. Y, relation. L, love, sweetness, etc. in relation. Interesting. So I was playing with this at one time. I don't know how accurate this will be, and it doesn't matter if you go back to those root sounds because they're meant to be, intended to be almost as the natural impulse from the sensation. So there's this word, the divine Leela, we say, divine play. And the Divine Mother, when she plays in the universe, she sports, we say Lalita. So L, E, A combinations in various ways. And I was looking at this. L with is, remember the sound is the absolute existence, E sound is relative existence. So L with absolute existence, L with relative existence, and L, Li, Ta or Li, La, the divine play, absolute relative in the L, sweetness in relation in love. That's the nature of the divine play. It describes the quality and the nature of the divine play as it stands in its most sensory, emotional way of perception. Upon that, the idea of divine play is a very different thing from this sensational quality. Observe the difference. So here we are at the sensation. R, guess, obvious, vibration, play. Sh, vehemence in union. S, repose, union. H, force. Now, I looked at the example which Sampadanand had given earlier of this st. We saw the examples of even English words which come with this word, s and th. And if you look at this list from the s, repose, union, so you can already see things coming together, coming into rest. And what does th bring into it as a sound when you combine? Th is touch, impact. Interesting. So coming into repose, union, and touch, impact. And you feel the combination of this st. So this gives you a glimpse of what that root sense is intended to carry. Now you will see in almost everything Sri Aurobindo has written, there are often three: dullness, persistence, obstinacy, or hardness, force, crudity. That is for T. Ch, swift, brilliant action, existence, contact. So swift, brilliant action, existence, contact. Three things. Almost everywhere you see three things. And I have not done this study, but I would be interested to observe whether this corresponds to those three, which we saw, the vibrational quality and then the emergent from it, the sense of a particular force and then the particular form, whether it corresponds to that. It needs a much more detailed study. I have not done that, but intuitively I sense perhaps since he has spoken of those three characteristics, is he even documenting those three? I don't know. This is left to others to work upon. But what you see from this, then Sri Aurobindo takes the root just a and goes into an elaboration of that with all its variations and secondary roots which emerge from it. So, and then all the words which are derived from it. It's a long list, and I don't even expect to be able to study that in this lifetime. But for those who are interested, just go through the list, look at the words, and you'll get the sense of the underlying sense of the sound and the effect it brings vibrationally, forcefully, form in when it is expressed. So this was the example I wanted to share of how this works. And we come now to the text of Kapali Shastriyar. And much of this we will have to keep for next time. But I will summarize in large chunks what he had to say about this. Remember, I had mentioned earlier, Kapali Shastriyar is the only one who already had the background of the Veda. He had the mastery of the Tantra. And then he comes to Sri Aurobindo and is able to correlate across these three in terms of experience and vocabulary. And so it's a remarkable, quite an extraordinary gift that he has made. So he describes how in the Veda there is this idea of the originating ether out of which the vibration and sound comes, which Sri Aurobindo has mentioned in that one paragraph. Shastriyar, Kapali Shastri elaborates on this. It's actually spanning two pages, but I will just read from a few fragments. We can now consider how the essential truths in the statements made above, he describes what are the fundamentals of the Vedic conception, that there is a supernal ether and there is an abiding place where the riks or the mantras of the Veda already exist as vibrations in that ether. All the gods and cosmic powers also reside there, and so on. There are certain basic assumptions, and then he says from this that from this statement above form the basis of the Upanishads and later scriptures in dealing with instructions on the character of the eternal word of which the sacred symbol is Om. So that first vibration, which includes all vibrations, is a resonance. Pure resonance in which implicit are every frequency, every variation and every wave. For it is the nearest representative approach in the mental and the vocal expression to the inexpressible fountain source of all original rhythm of the supreme ether. They will even say the original nada is unstruck and unheard. It's not a physical vibration. It's not struck. It's not someone who starts it. It is inherently. This ether of the sublime above is the native home of the primordial sound substance, of which the mantras are formations hidden in the higher planes and manifest in their descent to the last step, which is the human speech. So there's this continuum, but that's what you have to know if you want to understand this. The supernal Akasha, ether, is the imperishable source and perpetual basis of sonorous rhythms that issue from the heights to form the planes and build the worlds, and also to function by casting harmonic spells for their sustenance. So it is from those rhythms that even the worlds are formed. And this is a much larger part of the discussion, which Sri Aurobindo, of course, elaborates, but conveys to the modern mind. And so this is something more essential, that literally the rhythming out of every possible vibration and every possible relation becomes the basis for the worlds. And how? I'll just put it in a very simple way. Suppose you have every possible experience, every possible contact, every possible quality, every possible vibration all together at the same time simultaneously, inhabiting the same space. That would be the nature of the originating creative consciousness. Okay. What happens now? The things which are similar by resonance tend to coagulate. Things which are different by non-resonance tend to separate. That is what we experience in the physical domain, isn't it? In the consciousness domain, the same happens. Things which are similar coagulate, things which are different separate, but they coagulate to what is similar to theirs. And it is by such process that we have the appearance of so many worlds. So denser, cruder, coarser vibrational qualities coagulate, assemble as if in relation to each other, or are felt more distinctly in relation to each other, forming what we call the physical world. Things which are of the nature of force and energetic movement tend to interact with each other, binding into each other, engaging with each other much more to create what we call the life world of prana. But where is that world? Right here. They are simultaneously taking the same space, so to say, conterminous and, I forget the word, simultaneously intermingling into each other, as are all the worlds. But each world represents the coagulation or accumulation of similarities of vibrational qualities. But since none is ever separate from all else, all are interacting with each other simultaneously at the same time, the degree of interaction being different. In other words, the physical world interacts very little with the vital gradations. Vital interacts heavily with each other, physical with each other. But between the two also there is interaction, much less in relation to what you experience here. But they do interact, as also the spiritual, as also the Satchidananda, everything being simultaneously present at the same time. So it's as if in the rhythming out also the worlds form and the gradations form, except for our mental purpose we make them separate, and so it looks like this is farther away from that. In distance, it's not farther away in distance, it's farther away in vibrational similarity of contact and ability to interact freely. But if this be true, then in the physical world, some substance which receives, let's say, influence of the vital or the mental or the spiritual, there will be some, because there is interaction, everything being essentially made of the same one originally. There is some, this less. That material, let's say now vital physical substance, would tend to coagulate within the physical. Okay. Mental physical substance would tend to coagulate in the physical. Equally, in the vital, a physical vital substance, and in the mental, a physical mental substance would tend to coagulate. And then you would notice that the mental physical in the physical world and the physical mental in the mental world would have a reasonably closer correlation and interaction. So these would tend to coagulate and become as if bridges or links between the worlds substantially. Once you come to that, you will find within this there will be further finer gradations which will form, building a kind of a hierarchy, linking gradations of substance across worlds, which resonate. This vibrates with that vibrates with the next, that vibrates with the next more closely until it touches mind. Okay? Now the problem of stone, why stone cannot think as we do, is because that gradation of substance has mostly been evaporated by the heat processes of the stone. So nature now has to find ways by which that finer grade substance is accumulated upon stone, and it takes fine crushed powder of stone, dust, and upon that builds shapes, mechanisms by which that finer gradation can be accumulated. We call that plant, which now can vibrate with life force and receive now more directly life force influence to act upon what is still molecule of stone, or build upon it gradations of mental substance so that mind can now enter into it. And that's what our brain is. If you heat your brain enough, it will evaporate the mental substance, you will become stupid or you will die. So if that fine grade of substance is lost by evaporation, now remember it is substance which is almost mental. So there are mental processes which can evaporate it. So strong anger, strong passion will erase, dilute or evaporate the finer grade of mental substance. And you will lose link to higher mind functions. You'll find when you're very angry, you cannot think clearly because the link is lost with grade of mind processes. But where is mind? Mind is right here. The only thing which has gone is your ability to tune in to your mind processes of your mind body by the loss of that substance. If you can amplify this substance, make it more dense, more concrete, your ability to access mind world more directly will be also that much more direct, more complete, etc. So this is the basis also of the concept of brahmacharya and containing your higher refined energies, amplifying them, etc., in order to be able to access higher ranges of experience. Because they correspond to a vibrational grade of substance which is very, very refined. And by a normal process, nature takes a long time to build or accumulate that. Now, okay, I've drifted a little bit, but you understand how Actually, there is no such thing as separate worlds. There is only oneness and all multiplicities of all possibilities. The sense of multiple worlds is only a phenomenal experience. Or you can say, yes, there are worlds separated by the fact that they are vibrationally different. But this is where you understand this very simple statement that he makes, that it is from these vibrations that the supernal Akasha, ether, is the imperishable source and perpetual basis of sonorous rhythms that issue from the heights to form the planes and build the worlds. And also to function by casting harmonic spells for their sustenance. It is this Vedic idea and spirit that bristles in the utterance of the Upanishads, wherein the Rishi prays to Indra, the lord of the domain of mind, Swara, the divine power of the luminous heavens, whose vibrations of rhythms proceed from that world of the luminous gods, whose abode, as has been stated, is the self-same ether. He who is the bull of the Vedas, this is a translation from the Veda, he who is the bull of the Vedas of the universal form, he who was born in the sacred rhythms from the immortal, may Indra satisfy me through the intelligence. O God, may I become a vessel of the immortal. May my body be full of vision. Now you see, I won't elaborate on the translation, but you get a sense of how powerful or how important this prayer or call would be. And there is here this idea, the bull of the Vedas. And who is this bull? And Kapali Shastri speaks of the 4 gradations of Vak, which we have already spoken of. And then he says the speech, which is this creative speech coming from above, is literally the divine bull. Bull, unfortunately, is the translation from the root sounds, which represents this power, vibrating, roaring, creating by his sound. And now you understand the sense of the divine bull, that is the Vedic idea. Unfortunately, bull becomes, in the English translation, loses the sense of that Sanskrit word. Then he describes how the 4 stages of the speech correspond to the chakras from below rising. And in the tantric system, they correspond to the worlds descending from above, and equally in the Vedic system, what they correspond to. So he makes these very interesting correlations across. And the important point he comes to is that each of these is a deity in itself. And if you do not understand that, you have missed the whole point. Each of these root sounds, each of the sound is actually a being and a power. So, they start with the dictum that the word sound has a power inherent in it, and that this power varies with the letter sounds, and a proper use of these word sounds enables us to realize the truth in or behind the object it refers to. This theory of tantrics is based upon their first axiom that the word or sound creation precedes the creation of objects. Word sound, shabda, first, and artha, the meaning or the object, next. He explains again this whole movement of the sounds and the gradations. I don't go into it. And then he says, it is the same word, the sound, the rhythm, nada, that is at work in the formation of tiny things as of colossal objects. So what is in the infinitesimal is also in the macroscopic. That is at work at the formation of tiny things as of colossal objects. The tantrics discovered and promulgated a series of sound symbols selected from articulate speech as representing the rhythms that constitute the formations not only of material objects, but of others which are subtle and are of the subtle planes of the cosmos. Thus, the original word, the Vak, the voice of creation, which suggests the eternal syllable of the Veda, Om, or rather Auma, develops in the course of its manifestations into seed sounds of the tantrics. Bija aksharas, bij root, akshara immovables or eternals, which are charged with the principles of things, and in reality they have their own forms made of rhythms which stand behind the revelations and inspirations that greet the developed and higher faculties even as they compel and build the forms in well ordered vibrations and move into great cosmic measures. Now, there's much more which he describes, but I'm going to pause here. So, these root sounds are actually combinations of sounds which the tantrics found correspond to certain powers or experiences. They also correlate with the chakras, interestingly. They also are deities and conscious beings or powers of the divine at the same time. So not only you meet them, you receive their influence, but also as you activate them, as you release them through human speech and sound, they have effects both physical and subtle. Now this is the part which I want to now complete for today. Go back to what we discussed earlier about the planes. Everything is interconnected, everything is simultaneously present. The subtle worlds are right here, of a different grade of vibration, let's say, or subtlety to us. To that grade, they are solid to themselves. To them, our physical substance is too far away. When you release these sounds, they not only affect the physical air vibration, they also affect the subtle gradations and the vibrations there, particularly if your mind is tuned in to the physical process of the sound creation, holding the sense or the power implicit in the sound, or of which the power of which this sound is a representation. So as you speak here, you are as if releasing that vibrational force in the vital world and in the mental world, and to the extent you can, even in the spiritual domain. And so the physical vibration here is spanning across worlds and has effects on those worlds, and particularly from those worlds on the physical world. This is the rationale for those root sounds. I'm linking this to the question which Revati asked, what would words like Aim, Reem, Shreem, etc. mean? You can feel their power even as you speak. But this is the basis for those kinds of seed roots or immovables created by the Tantra. Now, this, what we say, is for our understanding here. The reality is, when you step out of your physical body and you are in your subtle body, sound there is found to be enormously more creative than in the physical, because the physical is a world of rigidity of form. So when you make that sound, yes, okay, the air moved a little bit, but the impact in the subtle worlds or in the subtle bodies is enormously more, because their form is plastic. And the vibration of that speech or of that sound can have a massive instant effect. I believe it is Buellman, one of those who goes out of the body, who documents how, I'm not sure if it is him, but one of these, he documents how one of the easiest ways for him to move from a lower plane to a higher plane was to chant Om. And immediately there will be luminosity and a shift in gradation of consciousness and a rise. Or others have spoken of how asserting loudly has had an immediate effect of changing reality and circumstances, even changing forms. So articulating an intention immediately as if activates the force of that intention in the results of those words, because the substance there is much more fluid. And as you go up, even more is this vibrational character creative. Therefore, to the Vedic rishis, the human speech and this creative power in a physical world through physical throat is almost a representation in material terms of something which is more essential and more powerful even in the psychological worlds. And in the spiritual worlds, the nature of the sound itself is indescribable and almost impossible to represent physically, the seed sounds, root sounds being as if the closest representation in sound quality in the physical world to what is experienced there. And that's how they will describe it. So you get a sense of this continuity. You get a sense of why the human speech is used as a description for the divine creative vibration or power. And Sanskrit as a language, although it undergoes these gradations of, let's say, limitation as it approaches the physical human speech sound, attempts to retain consciously this continuity of sounds and even the underlying powers and deities behind. Which is why when you speak with clear awareness and intention, and if possible, with the spiritual foundation of the experience which you are articulating, then the physical sounds are most completely able to carry the force of your experience and transmit it. So almost one would say the physical sound is essential in order to be able to carry it. If you wrote it out in word, you would lose the whole carrier potency. Therefore, among all the other texts of the sacred traditions of India, the Vedic alone you were forbidden to write. Not because it was, what's the word they have, impure or wrong, etc. There's no harm in writing. But because you would lose the force of transmission, of the sound power that can carry the force of the experience. Now, if you go back long enough to a time when those who articulated this actually held something of the experience, even if diluted and limited, this had great importance. If you come to a stage where people have actually lost even the original sense of it and have just learned by heart, then would this matter? Perhaps not. Or perhaps to one who is sufficiently receptive, even without understanding the words, when the chant is created, you feel the force of its action and it evokes in you something of the experience. Or if you realize that the chant is affecting things on other levels or other worlds and the effect they have on the physical world, literally drawing down from the spiritual, mental and vital worlds and a power, a vibration, an effect, an outcome into the physical world. Even if the person doesn't understand. Of course, it can be amplified greatly if he understands. Then you see the value of these Vedic mantras or any other mantra of such kinds where the root sound is linked to the inherent force. That is why when Sri Aurobindo, in the passage we read last time, when Sri Aurobindo says, the language of the Satya Yoga is based on the true and perfect relation of Vak and Artha, speech and meaning or sound and meaning. Every one of its syllables and consonants has a particular and inalienable force which exists by the nature of things. These are the fundamental sounds which lie at the basis of the tantric bija mantras, seed mantras, and constitute the efficacy of the mantra itself. In other words, with the bija mantra, seed mantras, the efficacy is in the sound itself. There is no understanding required even. And especially with these, for example, what Revati said, Aim, Hrim, Shrim. What is the meaning? At that point, you don't even ask the question. You connect to the force. But if you went back to the description that Sri Aurobindo has of those essential sounds and their psychological or qualitative characteristics, and then you decompose Aim, Hrim and Shrim, you might just get a sense of what they convey. Or you go into the tantric tradition where each of these would have a deity with a certain symbolism, image, shape, sound, color, etc. And you would activate that or evoke that within you. Use the sounds to realize the truth of that deity or the force of that power. Embody it by identification and a realization. Once you have that, then when you speak the sounds, then you'll have the full force activated, and which could produce even a physical miracle in the process. So it's not that everybody speaking the mantra produces the physical miracle. It's those who have identified with the power behind and now in speaking are actually bringing it in full force, they produce that miracle and so on. So such is the nature of that tradition, the science and the rationale behind the root sounds and their powers. which is still contained and held in the Sanskrit as we have it today. So I think for today we are going to pause here with two last correlations with which we will complete this discussion. In the text of the Lalita Sahasranama, and we have this little booklet where when Panditji made the recitation, and we have the translations here which were prepared by Vasantiji and Sadhanaji, my mother. So there is one particular name, one of the 1,000, this is 1,000 names of the Divine Mother. Lalita, she who sports and plays in the worlds and as worlds. So one of her names is Bhasha Rupa. She who is the form of language. She is the very form of language itself. She's the body of the language, and she is that. It's not that she creates that or she gives that. She is that. So here we find a deep insight which belongs to the Tantric tradition, that language is body of the divine or of the Divine Mother, of which these are special powers and so on. Each of the powers is as if an emanation of her and a specialized power of her. And such is the nature of that. And one last idea which comes from a letter of Kalpesh, where he correlates Paravak and the concept of this original vibrating creative power with a text from the Christian Bible. In the Gospel according to St. John, the very first verse translated goes something like this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this corresponds to that vibrational, creative, original state. So when you go back to most of the very ancient traditions, or to mystics who have had experiences of the higher realms, you'll find very independently across cultures, traditions, even cycles of time, they correlate these fundamental truths. Therefore, even when they are lost, they are rediscovered again and again, reformulated, rearticulated in terms of the current mind. And what Sri Aurobindo has done in the construction or reconstruction of this new science of language, and he says this, I think, in response to the question given by Subramanya Bharati, that this knowledge was given to him by Sri Krishna to reconstruct the original language. So it's as if here in this new age, with the current evolution of the human mind, as it is preparing to open to an intuitive age, Sri Aurobindo brings back this knowledge, or starts the process of bringing it back, so that an intuitivized mind would have a vocabulary or the capacity to be able to express itself from such a higher grade of consciousness, with a language which can convey something of the power and force of the higher experiences of the spirit. So I think this would be a good point to pause. I had one more comment I will make because it just strikes me. Bullish Harvey had made a comment that the works of life should be emphasized, not language. Your content should be relevant to what is happening in the world. Attaining concentration in the age of social media. There is no business and no time and energy should be wasted on ancient language. Your time and energy should be allocated to cultivating concentration among her children and your viewers. Yeah, but I think you've missed the point. And the point is this precisely, that we are in fact at an age when we are transitioning to a different grade of consciousness. And all the languages as they are constructed today have been mentalized in reductionist languages, and the awakening to a higher grade will involve necessarily, inevitably, the recovery of the pure power of expression and the manifesting force behind languages. And Sri Aurobindo recovering the roots is perhaps a small preliminary step for this recovery of the force of language itself. So today's session I have titled Manifesting Force, which is implicit in this language. I do believe eventually, as this becomes more and more visible to people's experience, that inevitably languages will drift back or even change to recover something of the Deva Bhasha, the original language of the gods. And for that purpose, Sanskrit will play an important and significant role. I have not looked at the comments in the chat box, but I will take a look and merge those into the next one. But I want you to pause with this idea. This is so important. All that we have discussed, all that we have read, recognize this movement of the creative manifesting force that finds means to express through sounds. And human language is only that, an attempt to give expression. If you go back to the history Sri Aurobindo describes from the primitive man to the mental man. But underlying that is a truth which is still valid even post-mentalization into an intuitivization. And so where it came by an instinctive impulse, in the intuitive consciousness it will come from a conscious articulation of the force of sound vibration. So we started with that spontaneous expression of vibrations, which became the basis for language, but we culminate in the conscious expression of the same vibrations, which becomes now the recovery of the divine language. Even more so as human beings become more and more telepathic. The force behind will become more and more pure, resting on the human speech. So you will share an experience, perhaps with a single word or sentence. And this is what you see happening in Savitri. A text like Savitri, yes, of course, there is the English language and the words and the rhythm and force of sound, etc. But behind it is a spiritual force. So as you read the words, you have the power that comes, sweeps in. But when you express that power with conscious awareness in speech to convey your own experience, that would be something of the new poetry, but also the new speech. Why not? Perhaps. So we can look towards that. And let's dwell on this, because it's a very important thing that you can hold deeper inside on an intuitive level more than a mentalized level. And appreciate also the basis for all these traditions of the Bij mantras, etc. I don't think I will dwell on them too much, but we have understood how it works, why it is important, and what utility it was given. And so we hold all this large body of knowledge spanning many worlds and just dwell on it for a while.